Hey guys, tonight we drift into a tale where crowns gleam and daggers hide behind silk sleeves. You walk the edge of candlelit corridors where every shadow could be a plot, every feast hides a betrayal, and thrones are not given. They're taken, often with blood. We're stepping into a quieter version of the world's most brutal chessboard, where kings and queens don't just rule, they outwit, outlast, and outkill. Tonight, we'll whisper our way through palaces and deserts, icy northern halls and sun-drenched empires, searching for the one ruler who might truly deserve the title, most ruthless of all. But be warned, you probably won't survive this medieval resume review without a few chills. Some of them may even be historical accuracy chills. So, before we drift any deeper, if this hushed little corner brings you even a flicker of calm, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right in your chest. And hey, before you get too cozy, drop your location and local time below. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now breathe slow, let the weight fall off your shoulders, and sink with me into tonight's slow unravelling of the past, right here on Historian's Diary. You tread across a floor once laid by empire makers, where strategy is colder than the marble underfoot. At the heart of every throne room lies a brutal truth. Power is rarely kept with kindness. Even in fairy tales, the crown comes at a cost. But unlike those neat little endings, real history leaves no clear winner, only a trail of crushed rebellions, arranged marriages, and suspiciously convenient plagues. You lean against the stone, ears open. Somewhere behind that tapestry, someone's deciding whether you live or vanish quietly before dawn. Every age had its tyrants, and its tyrants had their reasons. Some claimed divine right, others claimed national unity, and some just liked the thrill of making other people kneel. But before we crown our most ruthless ruler, we need to understand the game. Power in the old world wasn't just won on battlefields. It was sharpened in marriage contracts, cloistered letters, poison rings, and the subtle tightening of a tax policy that made your rival's coffers run dry just in time for rebellion. It was essentially a very long chess game, with real heads for pawns. Take this. Mainstream historians generally agree that centralized power flourished when rulers weaponized both fear and affection. A ruler didn't just need to be strong, they had to be admired or at the very least obeyed without hesitation. That's where the game gets dark. Because fear, it's fast, it spreads quicker than loyalty and lasts longer than love. Which brings us to tonight's real sport. What makes a ruler ruthless? Is it body count? Methods? How many sons they disinherited? Or monasteries they burned? Or treaties they broke with a smile? Historians still argue whether brutality should be weighed against results. Was empire worth the cruelty? As you lean into this question, the candle beside you flickers. You start to see the faces form in the smoke. Some are familiar, pop culture's usual suspects. Others, less so. But every one of them at some point stood on a battlefield or a throne and decided who would suffer to keep their crown upright. You'll meet horse lords who built empires across continents, and kings who executed their own wives before lunch. You'll whisper through castles where queens hid lovers behind trapdoors, and palaces where peace was just a pretty word for surveillance. And yet, some of these rulers gave their nation stability, even prosperity. That's the real tangle. Ruthlessness and success were often twin flames. When you picture the great builders of history, pyramids, walls, cities paved in stone, just remember, someone always paid for the blueprint, usually in blood or silence. Remember how crocodile dung once passed for birth control? Well, tonight we're swapping that medieval myth for something even more bizarre. A Persian king who allegedly had live sparrows shot from gold-plated bows during his morning hunts. Totally reasonable. Scholars debate whether this was an exaggeration or a court poet's career-saving flattery, but the story stuck. We've romanticised a lot of monarchs, polished their busts in marble, named streets after them. But underneath the titles and triumphal arches, many were masters of elimination, emotional manipulation, or just good old-fashioned threats. Some sent rivals to monasteries, others sent armies over mountains. One French monarch had a habit of regifting entire provinces, just to collapse their economies and force obedience. Another wore a perfume laced with poison to test whether it worked on visitors with sensitive skin. You can't make this up, but history kind of already did. This world, it ran on silence and spectacle, on public floggings and whispered treaties. The average citizen didn't know if their ruler was brilliant or just too scary to say otherwise. Most of them never saw the crown, only the tax collector who arrived before harvest. Even today, scholars revisit these lives like archaeologists digging up secrets, and they rarely agree. Some rulers were once called devils, now rehabilitated as visionaries. Others, once painted saintly, now wear bloodier robes in the light of new records. History shifts depending on who's holding the pen, or in our case, the pillow. So tonight, you're not just wandering the palace halls. You're slipping into council chambers, brushing against velvet curtains, eavesdropping on the real decisions, the ones never written into law, just whispered between wine cups and executions. And as the moonlight pulls through high-arched windows, you realise, to play the Game of Thrones, you didn't need dragons, just the patience to wait, the courage to act, and the ruthlessness to never look back once you did. You take one last step toward the flickering brazier. The room smells of iron and rosemary. There's a map on the table. Tiny wooden horses mark a border. Beside them, a single figure carved from bone, the king. This is where the game begins. Next candle. It burns in the wind of hooves and conquest, the coming storm of a warlord who had no use for treaties or thrones, only victory. You mount a horse not bred for beauty but for distance. The wind howls across the Mongolian steppe like an old war song, the grass low and dry beneath the hooves. It's not a battlefield yet, but it will be. The man ahead of you wears no golden crown, no flowing robes, just layered furs, a face hardened like hammered stone, and eyes that don't blink when blood is spilled. Genghis Khan. His real name? Temujin, born clutching a clot of blood in his fist, a birth sign the Mongols considered either cursed or blessed. Turns out, it may have been both. You trail behind him, the air thin, the sky endless. There's no throne room here, just a saddle and a bowstring. By the time he's done, he'll control the largest contiguous land empire in human history. That's not a legend, that's a fact. And he didn't do it by writing treaties or giving long speeches from balconies. He did it with precision and terror. He united fractious Mongol tribes not with diplomacy, but with absolute dominance. Follow or fall. Historians still argue whether this unity was liberation or subjugation, whether he brought order or simply replaced chaos with his own. Genghis didn't waste time. His early years were already stained with betrayals. His father poisoned, his family exiled, his wife kidnapped. Most people would have caved under that weight. He built an empire from it. The world had kings. He became a force. His military genius wasn't about overwhelming strength, it was about timing. His cavalry could move like water, quick, cold, and devastating. Armies who laughed at Mongols in the morning would find themselves encircled by dusk. Siege engineers, spies, deserters, even Chinese scholars, he used them all. Every weakness in the enemy was a nail in their own coffin. You travel with his messengers now, men who can ride across continents without stopping, carrying a message that could change the fate of kingdoms. The Yam system, a kind of medieval pony express, made his reach terrifying. You could wake up in Poland and feel the tremor of his name as far away as Korea. Still, he wasn't all fire and fury. He created one of the earliest passport systems, outlawed kidnapping of women, demanded loyalty, not lineage, meritocracy over nobility. In an age where most rulers inherited power through bloodlines, he gave it to those who proved they could hold it. But don't mistake structure for softness. When cities resisted him, he made examples of them. Entire populations wiped out, not in whispers but in roaring fires and mountains of skulls. There are accounts, perhaps exaggerated, perhaps not, of rivers running red for days. Historians still debate the numbers, but the impact is clear. When Genghis Khan approached, surrender was survival. In Persia, a Shah insulted him, killed his envoys, an unforgivable sin. Genghis didn't just retaliate. He erased cities, rerouted rivers to erase the names of those places from maps. His campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire was a lesson in strategic cruelty. One insult triggered a multi-year obliteration. You ride through burned gates and shattered statues. It's quiet now, but the bones beneath your feet still remember. This wasn't just military conquest. It was psychological warfare. He used fear like a scalpel, yet he was not mindless. He tolerated, even encouraged, religious freedom. Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, shamans, all practiced openly under Mongol rule. As long as they didn't resist, they could preach and pray freely. He had no patience for division that weakened the core. Even his laws, the Yasa, reflect a strangely modern mind. Loyalty was supreme. Theft was punishable by death. The army shared spoils equally. Women could hold property. It wasn't a paradise, but it wasn't chaos either. It was order built on the bones of rebellion. And still the image lingers. That of a bloodthirsty brute. The kind of figure used to scare children into behaving. But to his people, he wasn't a villain. He was the center of the world. And centuries later, some still call him the father of Mongolia. So was Genghis the most ruthless? Depends on what you count. If it's total destruction, total control, total dominance, then yes, he set the bar. But there's a glimmer of structure under the storm, a logic in the cruelty. You reach the edge of a battlefield now, the wind shifts, crows take flight. Behind you, the empire stretches like a shadow across the world. Ahead, a man who doesn't wear a crown, because he never needed one. His name was enough. And just before the dust settles, you hear a scholar's whisper. Historians still argue whether Genghis was a destroyer of civilization or its unexpected architect. You blink. The field vanishes. Now you're somewhere colder, darker. There's a church spire and bells tolling like a death rattle. A ruler waits there too. Less storm, more stillness. But inside him, something terrifying. You stand in a stone corridor that smells of incense and iron. The walls are thick, but not thick enough to muffle the echo of screams. They carry, soft at first, like the cry of wind through leaves, then sharp enough to stop your breath. A door opens at the end of the hall. No one invites you in, but you step through anyway. And there, seated beneath a dim-lit icon of Christ Pantocrator, is a man who rules not just by decree, but by dread. Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible. The title, often softened in translation, doesn't lie, but it also doesn't tell the whole story. You move closer, past tapestries stiff with dust. His eyes, deep-set and hollow, watch everything and nothing. This is not madness painted broadly, it's something worse. Precision edged with paranoia. He was Russia's first Tsar, crowned in 1547. Before that, rulers had been grand princes. He even made it clear, Russia would no longer bow to foreign powers or internal nobility, it would bow only to him. Historians still argue whether this coronation marked a leap into modernity, or a descent into something far more dangerous. You remember the boy he once was, a child born into power, orphaned young, neglected by the boyars, the Russian aristocracy, raised in a court of whispers and poison where allies vanished overnight and loyalty shifted like ice beneath foot. He learned early that fear was a better companion than trust, and when he finally inherited power, he didn't forget. The early years of his reign surprised everyone. He reformed the military, introduced a new legal code, and expanded Russia's borders into Kazan and Astrakhan. For a time, It looked as though Ivan might be remembered as Ivan the Great. Then something shifted. You hear the turn in his mind before it ever appears in history books. His beloved wife, Anastasia, dies suddenly. Poison, he suspects. Whether she was truly murdered remains unknown. Historians debate the possibility even now, but to Ivan, it didn't matter. Grief cracked something open, and from that fracture poured fury. He turns on the Boyers with surgical brutality, not all at once. First suspicion, then exile, then execution, then innovation, if that's the word, for his personal terror network, the Oprichniki. They wear black robes, ride black horses, and carry a dog's head and broom as symbols, sniff out treason, sweep it clean. You ride behind them through snow-draped towns where their arrival means only one thing: someone won't be waking up tomorrow. Their loyalty is to Ivan alone. They operate beyond the law because Ivan decides what law is. Even your shadow tries to shrink away as the Oprichniki pass. In 1570, in the city of Novgorod, the Tsar suspects betrayal. The punishment is not exile, not fines, it's slaughter. The population is ravaged. Estimates vary wildly, but thousands may have died. Monks thrown into freezing rivers, citizens impaled, whole districts torched. Even now, scholars hesitate to define whether this was military suppression or psychotic vengeance. The line blurs under bloodied snow. Ivan didn't just punish bodies, he punished legacies. Nobles humiliated, their names erased, others forced into monasteries, cloistered in silence. He understood something many rulers forget. Fear doesn't fade when the wound heals, it lingers, becomes inheritance. And yet, he was devout. He fasted, prayed, wrote letters that showed remarkable intelligence and theological depth. He even corresponded with Elizabeth I of England, floating ideas of an alliance, maybe even marriage. Imagine that courtship, but piety didn't soften him. If anything, it fueled the fire. In his mind, his actions weren't cruelty. They were purification, to cleanse Russia, even if it meant burning half of it. Then came the act no one forgets. It's 1581. An argument with his eldest son, an heir, a future Tsar. Words fly, then a blow, a staff. Wood, maybe iron, strikes the young man's skull. Blood, collapse, death. Ivan falls to his knees, cradling the body, weeping. But it's too late. You don't need to ask if it broke him. You can see it in his portraits, the way his eyes are always somewhere behind the canvas. He lives 5 more years, but it's as though the throne is empty. Even Russia, vast and grim, seems to hold its breath. Was Ivan ruthless? Absolutely. But was he mad? Historians still argue. Some believe his paranoia was fueled by genuine threats, foreign plots, internal betrayal. Others believe he crafted the threats to justify his own darkness. The truth sits somewhere between. A ruler who feared everyone, especially himself. You walk out of the room, boots silent on old stone. Behind you, the door closes. Not with a slam, but a slow, grinding groan, like the breath of history exhaling its grief. And just ahead, a place darker still, a forest littered with pale bodies and sharpened stakes. The name, familiar. But the story you've heard, only half true. You move through a dense forest where the trees stand too still, as if holding in a secret. The trunks are streaked dark with moisture, but it isn't rain you smell. It's older than that. Iron, damp earth, and something sharper. The silence presses in, unnatural. You step around a tree and that's when you see them. The stakes. They rise like twisted saplings, each one topped with what was once a man, or a warning, or both. This is Wallachia, and you've just entered the domain of Vlad III, known to history and legend as Vlad the Impaler. You've heard of Dracula, Bram Stoker's monster, but the man behind the myth didn't need fangs. He had sharper tools, His rule wasn't gothic fiction, it was methodical brutality, and unlike the vampires of stories, Vlad's thirst wasn't for blood, it was for fear. Born around 1431 in Transylvania, Vlad was the son of Vlad the Q Dracul, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric group sworn to defend Christendom against the Ottoman Turks, hence the nickname Dracula, son of the dragon. But young Vlad's childhood was shaped not by ceremony but by hostage-taking. The Ottomans held him and his brother captive for years, part of a diplomatic bargain. Historians still argue whether this experience bred loyalty or loathing, probably both. What's certain is that Vlad returned to Wallachia changed, hardened, focused. His path to power was not clean. Multiple claims to the throne, constant betrayals, shifting alliances. But once he seized it, he gripped it like a wolf with a bone. And he ruled the only way he believed worked, through terror. The method he's most infamous for, impalement, was no accident of cruelty. It was a calculated staged display. Victims weren't just executed, they were arranged, set upright on long stakes, sometimes left alive for hours, even days, twitching in agony for others to witness. These weren't private punishments. These were open-air theatres of dread. In one account, he impaled over 20,000 people outside the city of Târgoviște, arranging them in geometric patterns. When the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II approached and saw the forest of corpses, he turned back. No battle needed. The message had already landed. But Vlad didn't see this as barbarism. He saw it as justice. His rule came after periods of corruption and chaos. He punished thieves, liars, and traitors with the same severity as invading Turks. He believed fear was the fastest path to order. One tale tells of a golden cup placed at a public well, unguarded, untouched. No one dared steal it. To Vlad, that was success. You walk past a small village now, the kind you'd expect to be empty, but it's alive. Children carry firewood, mothers bake bread. The place is clean, orderly, no crime. Not because the people are saints, but because they remember what happened when they weren't. He waged a ruthless campaign against the nobility too. The boyars who conspired against his father were his first targets. Some were invited to feasts and never left. Others were forced to march, barefoot, to build fortresses. Those who survived were often never the same. Foreign emissaries suffered as well. A group of Turkish envoys refused to remove their turbans in his presence, out of respect for their customs. Vlad respected them too, by having the turbans nailed to their skulls so they'd never remove them again. These stories may feel exaggerated, but many come from multiple sources, some friendly, most hostile. What's undeniable is this: his enemies feared him more than any sword. And yet, he wasn't a lunatic. His military tactics were sharp, his political mind sharper. He played the Ottoman Empire against Hungary, leaned on alliances when needed, broke them when they no longer served him. He was captured, imprisoned, restored, betrayed again. His life a revolving door of thrones and dungeons. When he finally died, likely in battle around 1476, his body was mutilated. His head was sent to the Sultan as a prize, but his legacy remained rooted, like those stakes, deep in the earth. So was Vlad the most ruthless? In raw horror, perhaps. He turned punishment into performance. He ruled by fear in its purest form, and even centuries later his image lingers like smoke in a pine forest. You look back one last time. The mist rolls low, the stakes are still there, though the bodies are long gone. You wonder if the trees remember. Then you turn. Another ruler waits. No stakes, no forests, but courts full of silence and strategy. A woman this time, dressed not in steel, but velvet, and every bit as dangerous. Velvet rustles more sharply than armour, and her footsteps echo through a chamber where even the walls have learned to listen before they speak. You step into her presence, not with awe, not with fear exactly, but something in between. She doesn't need to shout. Her silence cuts more cleanly. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the woman who reigned over England for 44 years, not by brute force or inherited reverence, but through relentless calculation, and sometimes through ruthlessness hidden behind lace cuffs and clever words. Born in 1533 to Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, Elizabeth's very existence was political from the first breath. Her mother was executed when Elizabeth was barely 3. Her legitimacy questioned, her future uncertain, she survived a court that devoured women for far less. Historians still argue whether her survival was brilliance or just relentless caution. But by the time she reached the throne in 1558, she had already watched too many people lose their heads literally for trusting too deeply, loving too openly, or thinking too loudly. You sit with her in the Privy Council chamber, where decisions are made in whispers and ink. She has a talent for knowing when to speak and when to wait, and it's often the waiting that proves fatal to others. She inherited a fractured kingdom, religious tension, economic strain, and a court riddled with ambitious men expecting her to fail. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she spun them around her finger like thread. Sometimes she granted favour. Other times, she simply watched them twist themselves into knots, then let them fall. The executions didn't begin immediately, but they came. The most famous? Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin, a rival queen with her own claim to the English throne. At first, Elizabeth held her in luxurious captivity, a gilded cage, for nearly 20 years. But as plots multiplied, real or rumoured, Elizabeth made her move. Mary was beheaded in 1587. Not cleanly. The execution took more than one strike, and when it was over, Elizabeth claimed sorrow, claimed it wasn't her decision. Historians still debate the truth. Was she pressured, or had she orchestrated it from the start? You stand now at Tilbury, the English coast humming with tension. The Spanish Armada looms. Catholic Europe wants England back under the Pope's thumb. Elizabeth appears on horseback, clad in armour. She tells her troops she has the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king, and she means it. She was never a battlefield monarch like her father, never stormed castles or led cavalry charges, but her battlefield was diplomacy, language, and image. She weaponized virginity, made it a brand. The Virgin Queen. She married no one, not for love, not for alliance, not for heirs, because in remaining unmarried she remained untouchable. Marriage would have divided power. So, she played suitor against suitor, Philip of Spain, the French princes, even Robert Dudley, her favoured companion. She made them all believe they had a chance. None of them did. Her court was a place of performance, where poets and spies mingled behind fans and coded letters. She elevated men like Francis Walsingham, her spy master, who wove a web of surveillance that stretched across Europe. No letter was safe, no plot unseen, and yet she could be cruel, not with outbursts, but with precision. She banished advisors who disappointed her, stripped titles with a smile, sent old allies to the block when their loyalty cracked. One example, the Earl of Essex, a favourite in his prime, young, bold, charismatic, but he overstepped, led a rebellion. Elizabeth responded with firmness. He was tried and executed in 1601. She reportedly asked for his ring of loyalty before he died. He may have tried to send it. It may never have reached her. The truth is lost. The message remained. She ruled a Protestant nation surrounded by Catholic hostility. Her religious policies were designed not for peace, but for survival. She enforced conformity with fines, imprisonment, and, when necessary, death. Her reign saw priests hunted, rebels crushed, not always in daylight. So was she the most ruthless? Not in the bloodiest sense, but perhaps in the most surgical. Her methods were slow, deliberate. She let rivals think they were safe before striking. She let time do half the work, and when the blow came, It looked like inevitability rather than choice. You stand now in the shadow of the Tudor rose. Elizabeth is older, her face powdered, her robes heavy, but her eyes are still sharp. She's alone, always has been. No husband, no children, just power and the silence it brings when everyone else is gone. She dies in 1603, peacefully they say, the last of the Tudors. Behind her, a country strengthened, expanded, armed with navy and pride. But beneath that legacy lies the cost. Broken alliances, lost lives, a legacy sharpened by fear as much as by triumph. And now, as the English crown rests uneasy, your steps take you deeper inland, to palaces where kings discard wives like old gloves, and ruthlessness wears a round, ruddy face. The halls grow broader now, louder. The fires burn higher, not for warmth, but for show. You smell roasted meat, hear lute strings plucking a cheerful lie, and catch the scent of rosewater, trying too hard to cover up something heavier. You've arrived at the English court of Henry VIII, a place where charm smiles wide but consequence hides in the folds of the king's velvet sleeve. He isn't seated on his throne when you arrive. He's pacing, broad-chested, bearded, bejeweled. Every step he takes is weighted with the certainty that no man or woman will stand in his way. This is not a man who asks, he declares. And when those declarations are challenged, people vanish, sometimes into exile, sometimes into the ground. Henry ruled from 1509 to 1547, and in that time he reshaped England more completely than any monarch before him. Not just politically, but spiritually, culturally, domestically. He turned the world upside down to get what he wanted. And what he wanted, initially, was a son. He married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. She was a Spanish princess, well-connected, dutiful, and for a time beloved. But as the years stretched on and no surviving male heir arrived, Henry's restlessness became national policy. Historians still argue whether his obsession with succession was driven by ego, genuine fear for the Tudor dynasty, or sheer frustration. Likely all three. Either way, it set off a chain reaction that would split a continent. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage, Henry didn't just sulk. He broke with Rome, created the Church of England, installed himself as its supreme head, all so he could marry Anne Boleyn. And when that didn't produce a son either, when Anne gave him Elizabeth instead, she too was discarded, arrested, charged with adultery, incest, treason, executed by sword, imported from France for a cleaner cut. Then came Jane Seymour. She gave him Edward at last, a son, but died soon after childbirth. Jane was remembered kindly, perhaps because she didn't live long enough to disappoint him. 3 wives down, 3 to go. Anne of Cleves was a political match. Henry didn't like her face. He called her a Flanders mare. The marriage was annulled. She was lucky. She kept her head. Catherine Howard, young and lively, wasn't so fortunate. When rumours of her infidelity surfaced, Henry had her executed too. It's said she ran screaming down the hall when the guards came. The echoes still curl down the stone if you listen long enough. Finally, Catherine Parr. She outlived him. Barely. She soothed, managed, survived. She knew what the others hadn't learned in time. With Henry, caution was currency. And this pattern of punishment wasn't limited to wives. Advisors, nobles, childhood friends, none were safe. Thomas More, once his confidant, beheaded. Thomas Cromwell, who helped orchestrate Anne Boleyn's downfall, eventually met the same fate. Henry raised men up when it served him, and struck them down when it didn't, rarely with hesitation. Even his reforms, sweeping as they were, carried the scent of ruthlessness. He dissolved the monasteries, more than 800 of them, not just for reform, but for wealth. Their lands seized, treasures stripped, and the monks scattered. It was one of the largest redistributions of property in English history, cloaked in holy justification, driven by politics and greed. The common people didn't always cheer. Uprisings like the Pilgrimage of Grace tried to resist the religious upheaval. Henry responded with military force and brutal executions. Mercy was not a quality the king considered useful. Despite all this, he fancied himself a scholar, a musician, a philosopher king. He wrote pamphlets, played the lute, debated theology. But all of it was bent toward one purpose, his own supremacy. Every marriage, every law, every sermon from every pulpit echoed with the same message: the king is not to be questioned. Toward the end of his reign, Henry became increasingly unstable, both physically and mentally. Obese, riddled with leg ulcers, tormented by gout, and yet still feared, still obeyed. His courtiers learned to flatter, to divert, to survive. The line between service and self-preservation blurred beyond recognition. He died in 1547, surrounded by gilded furnishings and hollow silence. His 6 marriages had produced 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, each of whom would one day rule in their own way. But none would ever forget the cost of the crown they inherited. So was Henry VIII ruthless. Undeniably. He rewrote the spiritual map of his kingdom, carved a personal vendetta into national law, and sent the women who loved him, or tried to, into exile, humiliation, or execution. He smiled as he broke the world apart and insisted it was all God's will. You step away from his court now, the music still playing, though the dancers are long gone. The throne sits empty for a moment, but power never waits long. Across the eastern plains, horsemen are gathering. A storm is rising, and its rider carries no banners, only fire. The wind is different here, drier, charged, coiling with dust and history. You don't walk through this kingdom, you brace against it. The hooves of war horses thunder over cracked plains. The air tastes like ash, and when the horizon clears, you see him, wrapped not in gold, but in raw leather and bloodied armour, sword across his saddle, Attila, king of the Huns, or as trembling Romans called him, the scourge of God. He ruled in the 5th century when the Western Roman Empire was already a rotting tooth. But Attila wasn't just a symptom of collapse, he was an accelerant. He didn't arrive with apologies or slow diplomacy. He arrived with armies that moved like fire and thought like wolves. He inherited leadership of the Huns jointly with his brother Bleda. But shared power doesn't last in a world like his. Within a few years, Bleda was dead. Cause uncertain. The story varies depending on who's telling it, but most versions agree. Attila didn't weep. He ruled alone after that, and ruled absolutely. Under his command, the Huns weren't just mounted raiders. They were a strategic force shifting entire populations. Attila didn't need to conquer all of Rome. He just needed to squeeze it. And squeeze he did, over and over. He invaded the Eastern Roman Empire first. In 447, he led a campaign that brought destruction deep into the Balkans. Cities burned, people fled, rivers ran choked with retreat. Constantinople itself stood only because its walls held firm, and even then the Eastern Emperor paid. Gold, annually, just to keep Attila away. Historians still argue whether those payments were a tactical decision or a humiliating surrender. Either way, Attila understood what many generals forget. Fear is a currency, and every coin he extracted bought him more than gold. It bought time, attention, leverage. The Western Roman Empire fared no better. In 451, Attila crossed the Rhine and headed into Gaul, what would later become France. There, at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, Roman and Visigothic forces met him head-on. It was one of the bloodiest confrontations of the age. Tens of thousands died. The battle halted his advance, but it didn't break him. The next year he turned south, toward Italy, toward Rome. By 452, his forces were tearing through the northern Italian countryside, leaving cities like Aquileia in ruins. Panic rippled through the empire, and then, unexpectedly, he stopped. At the banks of the Po River, Pope Leo I rode out to meet him. What was said during that meeting remains a mystery. No scribe recorded the details. No treaty survives. But after the encounter, Attila turned back. Some say the Pope persuaded him. Others suggest famine or disease weakened his forces. Or perhaps Attila saw a better opportunity elsewhere. Whatever the reason, the world breathed again. For a moment. But make no mistake, it wasn't mercy that guided him. It was calculation. Attila wasn't a wild brute. He was coldly intelligent. He demanded titles, called himself descendant of noble ancestors, expected to marry a Roman princess, Honoria, after she sent him a ring and plea for help. Attila claimed her and half the empire as dowry. Rome refused. His final year was no quiet fade. In 453, on the night of another wedding, his latest bride Ildiko, Attila celebrated. By morning, he was dead. No blade, no poison. They say he suffered a nosebleed in his sleep and choked to death. Strange, sudden, suspicious. Some wonder if his new wife had a hidden agenda. Others see it as divine irony. The scourge of God fell not by sword, but by blood from within. He was buried in secret, his grave concealed, guarded, then erased. Slaves who dug it were reportedly killed to protect its location. His tomb has never been found. Somewhere beneath the soil of a forgotten riverbank lies the final silence of a man who terrified two empires. So, was Attila the most ruthless? In raw momentum, few matched him. He didn't build cities, he didn't write laws, he left no marble statues. What he built was dread, real, shaking dread. His name outlived his empire. His enemies forgot the battles, but they remembered how fast their cities fell. You look to the east, where dusk is thick and heavy. Behind you, charred fields. Ahead, a different kind of emperor. A man not born on horseback, but in jade-roofed halls, with dreams carved into mountains and maps stitched with walls. You step into silence so vast it hums. Mountains anchor the horizon, their spines pale against a pearl-grey sky. Beneath your feet, stone tiles stretch in perfect lines, unbroken for miles. You're in China, under the gaze of a man who ordered his kingdom carved from discipline and death. Qin Shi Huang, first emperor of a unified China. He rose not through war alone, but through vision so absolute it nearly devoured the man himself. Before him, China was a patchwork of warring states. Feudal lords squabbled, borders shifted like sand. But when he came to power, first as King of Qin, then as Emperor, he changed everything. By 221 BCE, he had defeated the 6 rival states, through military brilliance, betrayal, brute strength, and then he declared something no one had dared before, that China would be one, and he would be its absolute ruler. He didn't just claim power, he redefined it. Gone were the feudal families, gone were the regional coins, scripts, systems of law. Qin Shi Huang standardized writing, weights, measures, and even axle widths. Roads widened, walls joined, trade streamlined, and all of it unmistakably bore the stamp of the state, his state. You walk through the capital, Xianyang, where laws aren't suggestions, they're steel. The legalist philosophy guiding his court insists on strict control. Obedience is everything, dissent is weakness, and weakness is punishable. Historians still argue whether his legalist reforms created unity or crushed spirit, but their effectiveness, undeniable. His ruthlessness was efficient, but it wasn't clean. When Confucian scholars criticized his rule, he silenced them, not with counter-arguments, but with fire. The infamous burning of the books, philosophical texts, histories, poems, all destroyed in a single scorched effort to control memory itself. The past was no longer a mirror, it became a tool. and the scholars who clung to their beliefs, buried alive by some accounts, dismissed or executed by others. Either way, silence followed, deep and lasting. But it wasn't just minds he ruled, it was terrain. He ordered the construction of massive walls to keep northern tribes at bay, early segments of what would become the Great Wall. Thousands died in its building, peasants, conscripts, prisoners. They were not given graves. Their bones are said to lie within the wall itself. You feel the cold stone under your hand. It doesn't tell stories, it just endures. His obsession with control extended beyond his lifetime. Death was not to be a release, but another chapter of dominance. He ordered the construction of a mausoleum unlike any the world had seen, buried beneath a hill near modern Xi'an. Guarded by the now famous Terracotta Army, thousands of life-size soldiers, horses, archers, all crafted in secret and sealed underground. The emperor believed in immortality, sent envoys across seas searching for elixirs, swallowed mercury-laced potions, believing they would make him eternal. Irony, perhaps, that the very thing meant to preserve him hastened his end. He died in 210 BCE on a tour of his empire. His death was concealed for weeks by his advisors, who feared unrest. They rode with his body in a wagon of rotting fish, the stench musked by barrels of spoiled food, trying to keep the illusion of life alive. After his death, chaos returned. His dynasty collapsed within years, but the structure he built, the unified identity of China, endured. Was Qin Shi Huang ruthless? Completely. He ordered lives and cities to fall into line. He made obedience a national virtue, dissent a death sentence. He did not rule through affection. He ruled through systems and fear, and he made no apologies. You step away from the mausoleum. The silence feels different here. Not peaceful, but final. The kind of silence that follows a man who planned for eternity but couldn't escape his own body. The air shifts again. You feel the weight of fur-lined cloaks, heavy crowns and whispers in candlelit halls. A woman is about to step into power, not by inheritance, but through fire, scandal and unmatched intelligence, and she won't give it back. The room smells of ink and secrets. Silk panels ripple faintly in a breeze you can't feel. Somewhere behind the lattice walls someone is listening, because in this court they always are. And seated beneath a canopy embroidered with imperial dragons is a woman who should never have ruled, but did, and ruled long and ruthlessly. Catherine II of Russia, Catherine the Great. Born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess, she didn't begin as power incarnate. But when she married the future Peter III of Russia, she stepped into a game few women survived. What she lacked in pedigree she made up for in calculation. She studied the language, the customs, the palace alliances. She wrote in Russian before she ever ruled it. When her husband ascended the throne in 1762, it wasn't love that held their marriage together, it was survival. Peter was unstable, erratic, and unpopular. Within months, Catherine staged a coup. With the backing of the military and key nobles, she overthrew him. He was arrested. Days later, he was dead. Officially, of natural causes. Few believe it. Historians still argue whether Catherine ordered his death directly or simply allowed it. But she didn't mourn long. She was crowned empress, not by inheritance, but by seizing what she believed she could rule better than anyone else. You walk with her now through the marble halls of the Winter Palace, where every portrait has been hung with care, every guest calculated into her web. She isn't just a monarch, she's a performer, a philosopher, a tactician, and when necessary, a destroyer. She wrote letters to Voltaire, exchanged ideas with Diderot, surrounded herself with Enlightenment thinkers. But for all her intellectual glow, she ruled like a hammer wrapped in silk. Reforms came, but so did repression. She modernized law, expanded education, encouraged the arts. Yet she also crushed rebellion, censored critics, and expanded serfdom when it benefited the state. In 1773, a former soldier named Yemelyan Pugachev led a massive peasant uprising claiming to be her late husband, risen from the dead. The rebellion spread fast. Tens of thousands joined. Catherine responded with unflinching force. The revolt was crushed. Pugachev was captured, caged in a metal box, paraded through towns before being beheaded and quartered. After that, she tightened her grip on rural control. The nobility were granted even greater power over their serfs. Her rule might have sparkled in salons, but it darkened the countryside. Her foreign policy was equally bold. She expanded the Russian Empire southward and westward, into Crimea, Poland, and the Black Sea. She annexed territory not through raw invasion alone, but through manipulation, diplomacy, and strategic betrayals. Under her, Russia became a dominant European power, its borders swelling, its armies feared. Poland, she tore it apart piece by piece. Across 3 partitions with Austria and Prussia, she erased an entire sovereign nation from the map. Scholars still debate her motives, whether it was geopolitics, revenge, or sheer imperial ambition. But the result is beyond question: the destruction of a state and the suppression of its culture. And within her court she maintained control with an iron will. Lovers came and went, often elevated to high positions and just as easily dismissed. Some were given palaces, others vanished from favour overnight. Power was always hers, shared with no one. She managed the image of benevolence with surgical precision, sponsoring hospitals, schools, theatres, but all of it was framed around the crown. Loyalty was expected, dissent was buried. Not necessarily in mass executions, but in isolation, silence, or exile. She didn't always have to kill to destroy. She just had to erase. As she aged, the Enlightenment ideals she once championed were gradually set aside. The French Revolution scared her, proof that too much freedom could become fire. She turned inward, more cautious, more autocratic. She stopped writing to Voltaire. She stopped pretending reform was the future. Stability became her creed. She died in 1796 after 34 years on the throne. Her son, Paul, succeeded her. She never trusted him. In fact, she reportedly wrote a secret plan to have him passed over in favour of her grandson. It didn't succeed. So was Catherine the most ruthless? Not in volume of blood, but in elegance of control. She climbed through betrayal, ruled through charm and strategy, and outlasted every threat. She gave Russia pride, and ensured it cost others dearly. You leave the palace behind now, its gold-leafed domes fading into the grey. The next ruler waits in a land where sunbeams strike marble harder than swords, and monarchs believe themselves to be chosen not just by God, but by light. Light streams through tall windows and reflects off gilded mirrors until it seems to bounce forever, as if refusing to rest. You walk through halls where chandeliers outnumber swords, where the scent of fresh-cut flowers lingers long after the gardeners are gone. But the grandeur is not peace, it's performance. Behind the sparkle waits calculation, and at the centre of it all, wearing heels that add to his height and a wig that adds to his power, is Louis XIV, the Sun King. He doesn't just rule France, he is France. At least that's what he believes, and in many ways that belief isn't wrong. He came to power officially in 1643, at just 4 years old. But it wasn't until 1661, after the death of his chief minister Cardinal Mazarin, that Louis truly stepped into full control. He would never share it again. Not with ministers, not with generals, not even with the nobility. His first move? Make the monarchy undeniable. You follow him to Versailles, the palace he transformed from a modest hunting lodge into the most extravagant symbol of centralized power in Europe. It was not just a residence, it was a trap, a gilded cage for the nobility, who were lured by luxury, then bound by ritual. Louis created a court where every action, waking, dressing, dining, became a performance. Nobles competed not for land or armies, but for the honour of handing him his shirt or pouring his wine. Away from their ancestral lands, they lost their power. At Versailles, power meant access, and access meant obedience. This was absolutism, unapologetic and absolute. "L'État, c'est moi," he reportedly said. "I am the state." He built one of the most formidable bureaucracies Europe had seen, filled not with nobles but with loyal commoners trained to serve the crown. He expanded France's military, reorganized taxation, and oversaw an aggressive policy of mercantilism that grew the state's wealth, and his own. But behind the ceremony lay sharp steel. His wars were frequent, costly, and often born of ambition rather than defence. The War of Devolution, the Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, and the War of Spanish Succession, decades of conflict that left France burdened with debt, fields emptied, and soldiers buried in foreign soil. Yet for Louis, these were the price of glory. Historians still argue whether these wars were acts of overreach or necessary moves to solidify France's power. What they agree on, Louis rarely hesitated to send men to die for an inch more land or a title more grand. Domestically, his most ruthless act came not on the battlefield, but in policy. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, a law that had granted religious tolerance to Protestants in Catholic France. With the stroke of a quill, he outlawed their worship, closed their churches, and opened them to persecution. Soldiers were billeted in Protestant homes to harass them into conversion. Thousands fled the country, others stayed and suffered. He saw it as religious unity, his enemies saw it as tyranny. It crippled entire regions of the economy, as many of the refugees were artisans, merchants, intellectuals. But Louis saw disorder in difference, and he did not tolerate disorder. You watch him in council, where his ministers whisper and nod, never challenge. He keeps notes on every province, every appointment. He knows the price of grain in Normandy and the loyalty of a bishop in Lyon. He micromanages a continent-sized ego, one decree at a time. As he ages, his grandeur dims, but his control does not. His wars drag on, his people grow weary, famine comes, taxes rise, but he refuses to scale back. France must be strong, even if her spine begins to crack under the weight. He outlives his sons, his grandsons. When he dies in 1715, he has ruled for 72 years, longer than any monarch in European history. At his funeral, the crowds reportedly jeer, tired of his wars, his taxes, his grandeur, but his legacy remains. He left a centralized state, a transformed nation, and a model of absolutist rule that others would imitate and fear. Was Louis XIV the most ruthless? Not with executions, not with terror, but with time. He suffocated resistance not through fire, but through ritual, bureaucracy, and the slow, crushing weight of monarchy that never blinked, never slept, and never shared power. You leave the Hall of Mirrors behind, your reflection stretched and strange. Outside, the gardens bloom in unnatural precision. Every hedge clipped, every path planned. No leaf dares fall out of place. And beyond that, the red hills of Rome rise, waiting for the thunder of a ruler whose madness carved scars deep into an empire that once ruled the world. You step into marble corridors where opulence masks decay. The air carries traces of perfume, rotting fruit, and fear. Somewhere down these halls, musicians play softly, trying to distract the gods, or maybe the monsters. You're in ancient Rome now, and its emperor sits high, wrapped in silk, wreathed in rumour, surrounded by golden statues of himself. His name is Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but you know him as Caligula. He began as a darling of the people. His nickname Caligula means little boots, a reference to the tiny soldier's sandals he wore while trailing his father on military campaigns as a child. When he became emperor in 37 CE, Rome exhaled. They thought they were finally getting a stable leader after the dark reign of Tiberius. Instead, they got something else entirely. Historians still argue whether Caligula was mad from the start or if madness bloomed after power settled into his bones. Some say a near-fatal illness early in his reign snapped something in him. Whatever the truth, what followed was one of the most infamous periods in imperial history. He began by killing those closest to him, not enemies, family, advisors, his own grandmother. He eliminated anyone who remembered the boy, not the emperor. Trust wasn't an option, it was a liability. If he suspected you of ambition, you vanished. If you laughed at the wrong time, flinched during a festival, or prayed to the wrong god, you might find yourself summoned at dawn and never seen again. The Senate feared him, but he also humiliated them, forced high-ranking officials to run beside his chariot, promoted his horse, Incitatus, to priesthood. Talk of making it a consul, perhaps satire, perhaps not. With Caligula, the line between joke and decree evaporated. You move through his imperial villa now. The walls gleam with imported marble. Gold leaf peels from the ceilings. Statues of gods line the halls, each with Caligula's face carved over the originals. He declared himself divine, a living god worthy of worship. Temples were rededicated, statues erected. He walked through the city dressed as Mercury, Apollo, sometimes even Venus. When Rome suffered a financial crisis, he raided the treasury. When that ran dry, he taxed marriages, lawsuits, even prostitution. At public games, he would auction off senators' wives as entertainment. No one dared refuse. His military ambitions became theatre. One campaign led his troops to the shores of the English Channel. He ordered them to collect seashells as spoils of war against Neptune. Soldiers obeyed in terrified silence, but even in cruelty he was clever. His actions weren't random, they were layered with message. A senator's public disgrace reminded every noble what silence was worth. The execution of distant relatives signalled that bloodline was not a shield. When he kissed his sisters on the lips in public, it wasn't affection, it was power. Then came the fear behind the curtains. His secret police grew bolder. Trials became performances. People were tortured in front of their families. Property was seized with thin legal excuse. Every man with coin or land lived one whisper away from ruin. And when he ran out of enemies, he created them. You feel the tension thicken as you move through his court. No one speaks freely. Laughter is careful. Eye contact measured. This is what it looks like when a man holds an empire not with his hands, but with the tremble he puts in every heartbeat around him. He reigned just 4 years, but by the end, even his bodyguards could no longer protect him or tolerate him. In 41 CE, officers of the Praetorian Guard assassinated him, stabbed him in a palace tunnel. His body was hacked apart, left sprawled across the marble he had once called divine. His wife and daughter were killed too. The message was clear. The god emperor was mortal after all. Was Caligula the most ruthless? Not in military terms, but in personal terror? In the dismantling of trust, reason, and every comfort of predictability? Possibly. His Rome was not a place of law. It was a stage lit by paranoia, where loyalty was performance, and safety was only as real as his mood that morning. You step out into a city that continues without him. His statues are torn down, his name scraped from inscriptions, but the fear, that lingers. You can feel it even now, in the hush that follows his ghost. And beyond that hush, across the sea, another monarch waits, veiled in piety, robed in iron, holding a crucifix in one hand and a nation's future in the other. Smoke curls from the edge of the city, sweetened with incense, sour with something else. Charred paper, scorched fabric, and the invisible scent of lives overturned. You step into Spain, where the banners hang heavy with crosses and the whisper of an empire being purified by fire. At its centre stands a queen, small in stature, wrapped in ceremonial robes, and carrying the kind of conviction that doesn't flinch. Isabella of Castile. She doesn't shout, she doesn't need to. Her words are carried on parchment, prayer and punishment. She and her husband, Ferdinand of Aragon, have united Spain under one crown. But make no mistake, this is not partnership in the modern sense, this is strategy. Their marriage was a political merger, their rule a campaign of cleansing. Isabella came to the throne in 1474. A woman in a man's world, she had to fight for her right to reign. She negotiated alliances, deflected betrayals, and outmaneuvered rivals with more soldiers and louder claims. Once secure, she turned to reshaping her kingdom, not just in governance, but in soul. She believed it was her duty to create a pure Catholic state, and she acted on that belief with a force that would echo through centuries. You arrive at a tribunal. Hooded figures speak in Latin. A family kneels. They are conversos, Jews who converted to Christianity, or perhaps pretended to. Under Isabella, suspicion was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. In 1478, she and Ferdinand secured papal approval to begin the Spanish Inquisition. Its stated goal, to root out heresy. In practice, it became a system of terror, arrests based on rumours, trials where guilt was presumed, torture permitted to extract confessions, executions carried out in public squares to remind everyone exactly what happened when your beliefs slipped from the state-sanctioned script. Some say Isabella only reluctantly allowed the worst of the violence. Others argue she was its architect, cloaking hard politics in the language of faith. Historians still debate how directly she controlled the Inquisition's machinery, but the outcome was undeniable. Thousands imprisoned, tortured, or burned. In 1492, an iconic year, she issued the Alhambra Decree. All practicing Jews were expelled from Spain, convert or leave. There were no third options. Estimates range, but tens of thousands were forced into exile. Many lost their homes, livelihoods and families in the process. And yet that same year, another act of her rule would shape the world. She funded Christopher Columbus. It wasn't an accident of timing, it was vision. While purging heretics at home, she launched a campaign of expansion abroad. The New World, cloaked in opportunity and conquest, would become a new chapter of Spanish dominance and devastation. The riches that would flow from the Americas did not arrive without cost. Colonization under the Spanish flag brought systems of enslavement, the destruction of indigenous civilizations, and centuries of exploitation, and it began with Isabella's seal on a contract. But to her it was righteousness. The mission of Spain, in her mind, was not just political or economic, it was divine. The sword and the cross were not in opposition, they were partners. You walk with her through court. She's dressed in dark colours, her fingers calloused from constant prayer. Her mind is sharp, her gaze fixed. She was a devout Catholic, yes, but she was also a sovereign who knew how to wield power. She reformed the legal system, strengthened royal authority, curbed the influence of unruly nobles. She was a queen who ruled as a king. When Ferdinand was away at war, she governed alone, reviewed petitions, signed edicts, managed armies. She wasn't a consort, she was a monarch, and she made sure no one forgot it. Even her children became pieces on the board. She married them off across Europe, into Portugal, England, the Holy Roman Empire, each union a stitch in her expanding web of influence. She understood dynastic strategy as deeply as she understood doctrine. Her daughter Catherine would marry Henry VIII of England. You've met him already. You know how that story ends. But Isabella's story closes in 1504. She dies at 53. Her will is long, detailed, and deeply spiritual. She asks for simple burial, prayers for her soul, and the continuation of the cause she spent her life pursuing. So, was Isabella of Castile the most ruthless? She never wielded a sword herself. But her policies redrew maps, extinguished centuries-old communities, and helped forge an empire that would dominate the globe. She wrapped her rule in righteousness and acted with the certainty of one who believes history answers to heaven. You leave the citadel now. The bells of mass still ring, but farther away distant hooves echo over stone. A conqueror is rising, not cloaked in faith, but in ambition so vast it burns cities to ash and calls it foundation. The sun is low over the blood-coloured plains, and the wind tastes like sand and ash. You hear no court music, no sermons, no laws read aloud, only marching feet and the creak of war machines. What comes next does not arrive on parchment. It arrives with fire, and at its centre is a man who limps, but leaves kingdoms in ruins behind him. Timur, known in the west as Tamerlane, in the east simply as Timur the Lame. You watch him from a ridge. The sun casts a long shadow from his saddle, but it's not the limp you notice, it's the stillness, the calm of someone who's calculated every move before your sword even leaves its sheath. His body may be damaged, injured in youth, possibly during a fall, but his ambition, unwounded, towering. He was born around 1336 near Samarkand in modern-day Uzbekistan. A Turkic Mongol of the Barlas clan, he didn't inherit a kingdom. He built one from the wreckage of others, and what he lacked in lineage, he made up for in ferocity. Historians still argue whether Timur saw himself as the heir to Genghis Khan or as a rival to be remembered in his own right. But imitation or competition, the method was the same: conquest. He rose by uniting fractured tribes under his banner, eliminating rivals with swift precision. By the time he was ready to strike outward, he had an empire in waiting, and no patience for resistance. First Persia, then Mesopotamia, then the Caucasus, Central Asia, parts of India. Wherever Timur went, cities fell not by siege alone, but by message. He understood that destruction could be strategy, that the quickest way to end a war was to make resistance feel suicidal. You enter a ruined city in his wake. The streets are empty, the walls shattered. At the centre stands a pyramid, not of stone, of skulls. This was not isolated horror. It was routine. In 1387, the city of Isfahan surrendered after initial resistance. Timur still had some 70,000 civilians executed. Another city, Baghdad, saw an estimated 90,000 put to death in a single campaign. There was a system to it. Not rage, not chaos, cold deterrence. The next city in line would think twice. And yet, his empire wasn't just a trail of ashes, it was also a centre of culture, if you were loyal. He rebuilt Samarkand into one of the most resplendent cities in the world. He sponsored architects, calligraphers, engineers. The mosques he ordered glittered with blue tile and gold leaf. Traders came from across continents. Scholars thrived under his gaze. But beneath that glitter was fear. Even his treatment of religious leaders depended on their obedience. Timur proclaimed himself a defender of Islam, yet didn't hesitate to destroy Muslim cities that stood in his way. Damascus was pillaged. Delhi was burned. He marched under the banner of the Crescent, but wielded power like a sword with no loyalty but to himself. He claimed divine favour. That resistance to him was resistance to order. That the destruction he wrought was not cruelty, it was purification. A return to rightful rule under a stronger hand. One hand, his. He even aimed westward. In 1402, he met the forces of the Ottoman Empire, then rising in strength, under Sultan Bayezid I. Timur crushed him at the Battle of Ankara. Bayezid was captured, humiliated, and possibly held in a cage until his death. The Ottoman expansion paused. Timur had reminded the world who held the balance of violence. He never made it to China. That was his next plan. The Ming dynasty waited at the edges of his ambition, but in 1405, before the invasion could begin, he died en route, likely from illness. His army retreated. His empire, held together by fear and loyalty to one man, soon fractured. He was buried in Samarkand in a tomb called Gure Amir. When Soviet archaeologists opened it in 1941, they found an inscription: "Whoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." The next day, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union. Coincidence, perhaps, but the aura of Timur has never been one of peace. So, was he the most ruthless? His numbers challenge even Genghis. His campaigns made cities vanish, repopulated them with bones, and left survivors whispering his name generations later. But he also left beauty, commissioned art, elevated culture, built monuments meant to outlast fear. You walk away from the dust now, your boots heavy with history. The next ruler you'll meet won't ride in from the steps. He'll emerge from shadows, political backrooms, and church steps slick with ambition. And this time, it's not an emperor, it's a prince, with daggers, not armies. A damp mist clings to the alleyways, thick with incense, candle smoke, and secrets. You're in Renaissance Italy now, where the cathedrals ring with choirs and the courtyards murmur with plots. The palaces are smaller here, but sharper. Less a stage for splendour, more a theatre for survival. At the centre of this theatre stands a man raised for greatness, sculpted by ambition and sharpened by violence. Cesare Borgia. He was the illegitimate son of Rodrigo Borgia, better known to the world as Pope Alexander VI. Yes, Pope, the father of a prince. The line between holy and power, already thin in Rome, dissolved entirely under the Borgias. Cesare was born into corruption, and he turned it into an art. Originally groomed for the church, Cesare became a cardinal at a young age, but red robes didn't suit him. After his brother's suspicious death, historians still argue if Cesare was behind it, he abandoned religion for war. He cast off the cardinal's cloak and put on armour. He wasn't a king, not officially, but don't be fooled. Through his father's papacy and his own military cunning, Cesare controlled vast swaths of central Italy. Dukedoms, cities, fortresses, all bent to his will or broke under it. His rise was swift and brutal. Through the papal throne, he gained political leverage. Through the sword, he ensured loyalty. He crushed rival families with surgical cruelty. The Orsini and Colonna, once pillars of Roman nobility, were dismantled piece by piece. Lands confiscated, heirs executed, castles razed. You walk beside him now on a cobbled road leading to one of his fortresses. The walls are high. The guards lean close to the torches. Inside, there's no dancing. Only silence, calculation, and fear. Cesare didn't rule by law. He ruled by necessity. Loyalty was rewarded, briefly. Treachery answered without trial. And he understood something most rulers pretended not to. Appearances mattered more than justice. When he couldn't outfight his enemies, he outmaneuvered them. He'd offer peace, grant pardons, and then, when they relaxed, strike. A duke who dined with him in peace might be strangled in his bed before sunrise. He considered this not cruelty, but efficiency. Machiavelli saw him in action and took notes, real ones. The Prince, that slim book on power that has unnerved generations, was heavily inspired by Cesare Borgia. Machiavelli admired his decisiveness, his ability to rule with fear and foresight. He wrote of Cesare not as a monster, but as a model. And yet, for all his brilliance, Cesare's fate was tied too closely to his father. Pope Alexander's death in 1503 ended their dynasty's backbone. The new pope, Pius III, died within weeks. Julius II, no friend of the Borgias, ascended next. And Cesare's enemies smelled blood. One by one his territories were reclaimed, his allies flipped, his funds dried. He was arrested, imprisoned, released, then captured again. Eventually he fled to Spain, then Navarre, serving as a mercenary. He died in 1507 during a minor skirmish. Not in a great battle, not with ceremony, just stabbed in the chest, stripped of his armour, and left in a ditch. A quiet end for a man who once dreamed of carving his own kingdom from the heart of Italy. Was Cesare the most ruthless? He was not the bloodiest. But he understood the mechanics of fear like few others. He lived at the intersection of church and dagger, where mercy was dangerous and hesitation fatal, and for a time he ruled like no one else could, not because of a title, but because everyone knew what he was capable of when crossed. You step out into the early Roman dawn, where pigeons flap across broken statues and the past curls like smoke around crumbling columns. But now the wind shifts again. You move far east past deserts and rivers to a throne that begins soaked in blood, but doesn't end that way. A ruler who began as a destroyer and became, perhaps, the most unexpected thing of all, a repentant soul. The dust blows warm across the plains, the scent of scorched earth trailing every footstep. You walk along a battlefield that has long since quieted, but the ground remembers. Spears broken underfoot, bones buried just beneath the soil. The sun presses down as if to warn you, this is no place of peace. It was once ruled by a man whose name came to mean annihilation. But strangely, that's not how his story ends. Ashoka, emperor of the Maurya dynasty, the man who began as a conqueror of kingdoms and ended as a self-declared servant of his people. He ruled the Indian subcontinent in the 3rd century BCE, inheriting an empire already vast from his grandfather, Chandragupta Maurya. But Ashoka was not content to preserve borders. Expansion was the goal, and early in his reign, he pursued it with relentless force. You travel now to the edge of the Kalinga region, a small kingdom that stood between Ashoka's empire and complete eastern dominance. In 261 BCE, he launched an invasion. What followed was not just a campaign, it was carnage. Tens of thousands died. Accounts from the time speak of 100,000 killed, with more wounded or displaced. The dire river flowing nearby was said to run red. The conquest of Kalinga was swift and brutal, and then something happened. Ashoka stood on the battlefield after victory, but what he saw wasn't triumph, it was devastation. Families torn apart, forests blackened, the screams of survivors echoing through the valleys. That moment, according to the inscriptions he would later order carved in stone, changed him. He didn't just feel regret, he altered course. He renounced expansion through violence, abandoned further military conquest, and instead turned his empire into something rare, a realm ruled by principle. Historians still argue whether the transformation was sincere or politically motivated, whether Ashoka had a true crisis of conscience, or merely recognized that unity built on fear couldn't last. But the transformation reshaped his reign, and perhaps the entire subcontinent. You read the edicts he had carved into stone pillars across his lands. There are dozens of them, planted like messages to the future. They speak of kindness, tolerance, fair treatment of prisoners, and protection for animals. He ordered the building of hospitals, the digging of wells, the planting of medicinal herbs. But it wasn't just domestic change. He spread the teachings of Buddhism across Asia, not by sword, but by envoys. Under his sponsorship, the religion travelled to Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and eventually China and beyond. He didn't mandate belief. He encouraged harmony between sects, promoted religious dialogue, and emphasized what he called Dhamma, moral living, truth, restraint, compassion. You walk now through one of his ancient capitals. There's no golden throne or towering statue of him, just quiet stone, soft inscriptions, and the whisper of something almost unheard of in the annals of ruthless rulers, remorse. And yet, he was still emperor, still absolute, still capable of enforcing will when needed. He didn't dismantle his armies, he didn't give up his title, but he wielded power differently, less as a hammer, more as a scaffold, building something instead of simply breaking it. That kind of rule came with its own risks. Some of his policies weakened the traditional authority of Brahmins and local warlords. Some of his messages were unpopular. Governance through virtue, as it turns out, isn't always easy to implement, but Ashoka persisted. He reigned for nearly 4 decades after Kalinga. When he died around 232 BCE, He left behind not just a larger empire, but a transformed one. His successors could not maintain it. The Maurya Empire fragmented over the following decades, but Ashoka's reputation lingered. Centuries later, Indian nationalists would revive his image as a symbol of unity and ethical leadership. His symbol, the Wheel of Law, now sits at the centre of India's modern flag. Was Ashoka ruthless? In the beginning, undeniably. The conquest of Kalinga stands as one of antiquity's most devastating military actions. But what sets him apart is what came after. Few rulers repent. Fewer still act on that repentance. You step away from the riverbank now, where reeds still bend as if in prayer. The dust settles, the air cools. Behind you, a ruler who found something unexpected in the middle of conquest. A conscience. But ahead waits something very different. Not redemption, not regret, just cold strategy. The final face in this long march of power, one that smiled while others bled, and left behind a shadow so long it still curls through the corners of today. The corridors narrow once more, not from poverty nor from ruin, but from precision. Each stone laid with intent, each arch calculated. You're in Florence now, or perhaps Rome, or maybe somewhere between myth and memory. The walls don't echo with screams, but with whispers. Political, deliberate, often deadly. The man who waits here doesn't command empires. He doesn't march armies. He doesn't wear a crown. But his name lingers like a knife pressed gently at the throat of history. Niccolo Machiavelli would write about him. Kings would fear to imitate him too openly. And even centuries later, his legend still draws a breath of unease, because while others ruled with iron or fire, this one ruled with nothing more than a smile, and the quiet threat that you would not see it coming until it was too late. The final ruler in your journey is not a king, a queen, or a conqueror. It is power itself, distilled into human form, an archetype, a figure whose identity matters less than what he reveals about the nature of ruthlessness. The lesson, not the lineage. You stand now before the metaphorical weight of every throne you've passed, the blood on the steps of Versailles, the smoke rising over Kalinga, the bones buried in Timur's trail, and from this vantage point you see it clearly. The most ruthless rulers were not those who burned the most or killed the fastest. They were the ones who made cruelty a structure, who turned fear into habit and loyalty into currency. You sit beside the last figure now, undefined, composed of all who came before. Their voice, if they speak, is quiet. They don't raise it. They don't need to. Their power is already moving, carried on the breath of others. Here, finally, the lesson unfolds. The real Game of Thrones is not won by being strongest or loudest or even cruelest. It's won by enduring, outlasting, remaining long enough that others carry out your will even when you're gone. Was there a single most ruthless ruler? Historians still argue, Genghis for scale, even for terror, Elizabeth for precision, Timur for devastation, Ashoka perhaps for being the rare one to turn back, and yet the title itself might be a trick, because ruthlessness doesn't sit on just one throne, it travels. You've walked beside them all now, through burned cities, glittering courts, frostbitten fields, and silent prayer halls. And as night deepens and the last torch flickers low, you realize something else. The past doesn't rest, it watches. And somewhere, just ahead of us, another ruler waits to be remembered or forgotten. So now we let go. Breathe slower now. Let the weight slide from your shoulders. Every name, every crown, every shadowed corridor. Let them drift behind you like smoke, like a fog that no longer reaches your feet. The fires are out, the halls are quiet, the battlefields have gone still, stitched over by centuries. You've walked a long road tonight, past fear and iron, past ceremony and cruelty. You've felt the cold sting of ambition and the strange silence that follows it. Now imagine soft earth beneath your feet, the hush of a field where nothing moves but the wind. The stars return overhead, untroubled by history. No armies here, no tribunals. Just the slow, steady rhythm of night. And you, finally, away from the thrones, the masks, the choices you never had to make, you're safe here. Not because the world has changed, but because you've stepped outside it, even if just for a moment. Let your breath stretch longer now. Let your thoughts untangle. You've seen the game for what it is. You've learned what power demands, and now you can leave it behind. Let your chest rise and fall with ease. Let the hush settle in your bones. Sleep knows where to find you. End of script. Sweet dreams.